Hello, everybody. Welcome to the SoxProspects.com podcast. Happy New Year. Thank you for joining us here on the web's number one podcast of the number one source for information on the Boston Red Sox farm system from top to bottom, from Fort Myers to Pawtucket and all stops in between. Thank you for the listen. My name is Chris Hatfield. I am the executive editor of SoxProspects.com, and I am joined, as always, and ringing in the new year with our director of scouting, Ian Kundle. For a very exciting episode, Ian. I think people are going to like what we've got in store for them.
Yeah, we have a special guest, and I think it's a great way to kick off the new year.
Yeah, we were joined by Alex Speier of the Boston Globe for what's basically his yearly appearance on the show. Talking all things Red Sox organization, talking about pitching development, talking about, that was a highlight for me. Any highlights for you? I mean, we talked about a lot of stuff with him.
Yeah, I mean, that was obviously how we kick things off, and we kind of circled back to it at the end. Mm-hmm. But I think also, at the end, we talked about who we think could be the top prospect next year, which I think was a pretty interesting discussion. So, you should probably listen to the whole thing because there's a touch on a lot of subjects. And
where we awkwardly egg him on to mention a particular prospect.
He was going to do it.
I'm so glad it paid off.
Yeah.
No, but thank you to Alex for coming on. We also talked to him about topics on the Major League side, too, so we did not ignore that when we had Alex here. So I'm sure you all are going to like it. It was a really great conversation, as it always is with Alex. As always, we want to thank our supporters on patreon.com/SoxProspects. And in particular, we want to name drop our $5 level Patreon supporters, who I'm now going to try to get through without coughing or breathing for the second time in about 10 minutes. I don't think I'm going to be as successful this time because I've got a cold. But here goes. We want to thank Sox Signatures, Kirby Miller, Kyle Kostick, and Tyler Woodrow, Jeff Trainer, David Nardone, Tim Harding, Ernest Shermer, Bill Stanton, Deb Kendall, Evan Kirkwood, Chris Fox, James O'Hara, Nathan Kenyon, Andrew Wallen, and Lendl Martin. Thank you to all of them, and thank you to all of our supporters on there. Again, it's patreon.com/SoxProspects. And, of course, send your emails to us at podcast@SoxProspects.com. We're not going to hit any emails on this episode because we have the interview with Alex, but we want to talk about what you want to hear about, so email us. Again, that's podcast@SoxProspects.com. We're not going to record an outro, so I want to send a thank you to our podcast editor, Joe Tetrault. Joe is kind of the guy who the straw who stirs the drink, I think I would call it, for the podcast. He's the one who edits the show together. Sometimes we have technical issues, sometimes we have screw-ups, things that need to get fixed in post-production. He does that for us, and we really appreciate everything he's done for the show since joining, so thank you for that, Joe. Of course, you can follow us on Twitter. You can follow Ian at Ian Kundle, that's IANCUNDALL. You can follow me at SP Chris Hatfield, and make sure you follow the site at Sox Prospects. We're going to have some more podcasts this offseason. I think we're going to try and focus more on interviews, maybe some people within the organization, some people without the organization. We've got some ideas we're throwing around, so we're going to get on getting you some more great interviews. But, Ian, I think we might as well throw it to our talk with Alex. Does it sound good to you?
Yes.
All right. Well, I hope you all enjoy, everybody, and thanks for the download. Here's our talk with Alex. All right, so we are now joined by a friend of the podcast, and, Alex, it's kind of funny. Our last episode of the podcast was episode number 150, and I'm kind of kicking myself that we didn't time it to have you on. Alex Speier of the Boston Globe, a multiple-time Sox Prospects podcast guest. I wish we had timed it so that you could have been the guest for 150, but maybe 151, I don't know, being an alcohol reference is good. I don't know. But at any rate, it's always a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you for joining us in the off-season doldrums of yet another just snoozer of an off-season to talk some baseball and try and get some baseball excitement out of it.
Hey man, some of us need to hibernate for a little while after the end of a season that threatened Halloween. As a dad, that was getting to be a tight one. Well, with some serious dilemmas about how much trick or treating could have been done with my kids prior to getting to Fenway Park.
Oh my God, it's funny because we hear about how Alex Cora threatening to really kind of slow play the pitchers into the season, but probably with good reason when you look at what guys like Sale Price and Eovaldi did in the postseason, but just being on the beat and being at the park every day. I mean, it by the end of October, is everyone just kind of like, okay, can the season end now? I would like to go home and spend time with my family.
Well, I think that once you get, once a team plays really well in October, then you're kind of interested in seeing them explore the limits of it. But again, having October 31st off as a parent with with young kids is a pretty big deal. So, so Mazel Tov Red Sox for winning in 5.
That's true. I mean, I enjoy it, not having kids and just giving out candy. So I can imagine. But well, we've got plenty to talk about. I mean, of course, you've got some interesting stuff that you've written up even recently for the Globe that we want to make sure I ask you about. And of course, we always talk about your Red Sox top prospects list that you put together for Baseball America every year, and of course, any number of topics within the system and in Fenway that could be out there. But like I alluded to, I think maybe a good place to start is just recently you had a really interesting article in the Globe that I kind of almost consider like a follow-up piece to one that you had over the summer on just kind of the development and just kind of, it seems like light years jump ahead that the organization's had in its development of its pitchers, both in the majors and in the minors, and just how they're incorporating technology, kind of spearheaded by, of course, Brian Bannister, Dave Bush working with him in the minors, and, he's got a whole staff he's starting to develop now. I love the name of the Pedro system they have. I mean, this is just, it seems like the organization really got kind of sort of, not complacent, but just to kind of plateaued out a little bit on its development of methods and training and analysis. And it seems like it's taken a light years step ahead with the article that you had in the Globe the other day, reading about that and reading about bringing the minor leaguers up to Fenway and having them pitch at Fenway with all the, slow motion cameras and things they have there. This seems like something, you've obviously been talking with the guys in the organization about a lot. I mean, what's kind of your big picture take on what this system is at this point, how far it's coming? I mean, it seems like it's just a completely different, just mechanism and completely different environment for developing pitching and improving their pitchers that we've seen from them, even just as recently as like a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Brian Bannister was hired to the role of, at the time, I think he was referred to as something like VP of pitching analysis or something, pitching development and analysis in late 2015 after Dave Dombrowski had been hired. And I think that, that his taking on that role did mark a sea change in terms of what the Red Sox were doing with their pitcher development. And, I think that the emphasis has honestly been on kind of taking a more direct path of getting guys to whatever impact role they're going to have. I think there's been a greater comfort with moving guys into bullpen roles faster, or having guys develop. If a guy doesn't have a curveball, not having him develop it for 3 years while beating his head against a wall, but instead saying, okay, can you throw a slider? Can you throw a cutter? Trying to optimize his pitch mix as quickly as possible after he gets in the minors, so that you can have guys making an impact as quickly as possible. And I think that there used to be a sense that, there's a chance if we make these moves quickly that we're going to lose the opportunity to develop him in as a starting pitcher. And frankly, that kind of methodical approach, that slow play approach to seeing if they could develop starting pitchers, didn't yield any starting pitchers, we've all discovered over the, as we've all discussed ad nauseum. And so what you have seen is the Red Sox making an impact in their player development, both in terms of graduating relievers to the big leagues, guys like a Ryan Brazier, who Bannister had identified a couple of years ago, even before he had gone to Japan, as someone who maybe had interesting secondary stuff, didn't use it very often, overemphasized his fastball. What would happen if you took these raw materials of a guy who could actually spin a breaking ball, in his case a slider, and maybe every once in a while flash to split, and emphasize those pitches more along with that mid-90s fastball? There were some interesting raw materials there, and they were able to reconfigure the way that he used them in pretty short order in order to unlock some interesting impact, and obviously serious impact when it came time. You're looking at the guy who was their probably third highest leverage middle reliever in the postseason, if we don't count all of the starting pitchers. Right. So they or if you look at the development of of Steven Nogasek, who was they committed to him as a reliever only and quickly turned him into a piece in the trade for Addison Reed. They've committed to developing other relievers. Gerson Bautista ended up being a piece in that same Addison Reed trade. So they've been able to recognize that if they can get guys looking pretty decent as relievers, then either they have a chance to help them quickly in the big leagues, or they have a chance to become valuable as trade pieces. And so I just think that they're more efficiently they're more efficiently moving guys through the minors and capturing value for them if their ceiling is in fact that of relievers than maybe they would have in the past. Instead of taking 3 years to develop Alex Wilson as a starter, and then when everyone knew that his ultimate role was going to be as a reliever.
Right. I mean, it's the comparison between, to go polar opposites. You've got Craig Hansen on one hand, although I guess they did rush him to the majors and put him in the bullpen, but they even tried him as a starter.
Yeah.
If that Red Sox administration drafts Durbin Feltman, do they mess around with him as a starter for a year and a half?
Well, I mean, we should also, in fairness to past administrations, right? There was also Bryce Cox. Am I remembering that correctly? 2006, maybe second rounder.
Good call.
They thought was going to fly through the system as pure reliever and be the closer for the 2007 Red Sox until they moved Jonathan Papelbon back there, and of course Bryce Cox never ended up sniffing anything close to the big leagues. But Daniel Bard is a kind of instructive case where they developed him as a starter. That didn't go so well. Then they moved him to a reliever. That went really well. Then they decided to develop him as a starter again. That didn't go so well at the major league level. There was generally a greater commitment to try to maximize value by trying to develop as many starters as possible. And along the way, maybe you lost some value of potential relievers. Bannister is of the mind that that most guys are going to end up being relievers unless there's a very select class of guys, usually taken in the top 15 picks of the draft, or very early, or the high ceiling high school guys early in the second round, places where the Red Sox don't usually get to pick. So there are guys obviously who they're developing as starters, but they have, but in terms of the significant organizational bias of starting pitchers being worth a ton more than relievers, that's kind of flattened out a little bit, and that's changed some of what they're doing developmentally. But, it also gets to the tools that they're using to evaluate guys and to figure out how to maximize their abilities, whether it's kind of the quote unquote biomechanics lab of slow capture video cameras at Fenway and having prospects come up in season so that they can see everything about their delivery in a way that gives them some reference points to figure out why they might be struggling to manipulate the baseball in a given moment, or whether or not they are healthy in a given moment. So things have changed from an operational standpoint, certainly. Whether or not we're still waiting to see whether or not that eventually yields a starting pitcher, but I think that there's a diminished desperation or diminished hand-wringing about whether or not they're developing starters right now. And I would also note that they did develop one important starter, Jalen Beeks, who, they developed him enough that they convinced the Rays, and I think quite rightly, that he has a chance to be, a solid back-of-the-rotation guy who in turn was valuable enough to get them Eovaldi for this season.
Yeah, he was kind of the guy that was on the tip of my tongue as you were talking, and you look at, we said this when he got traded, the Rays are almost a perfect fit for him, because you look at that kind of piggyback role that they have guys coming in after the opener. It's just kind of like, wow, that seems to fit him to a T. And
they love the left-handers who come in after the hard-throwing right-handers.
Right.
Him, Yarbrough. It's you're exactly right. They're he represented a great ball of clay for the Rays, in the same way that Eovaldi represented a great ball of clay for the Red Sox.
Mm-hmm. And it really does seem like it's, while the system, and we'll talk about the system as a whole in a second, but at least on the pitching side as it relates to this, it's funny, the balls of clay does seem to apply. They've got a lot of guys that could turn into more, it feels like, on the pitching side. They've got some volume of guys in AAA and maybe down to AA, depending on how wide a net you want to cast to get, say, a Darwinzon and Hernandez in there, of guys who could help in some role in the majors, right? There are guys who are already in the bullpen, like a Lakins, or some of the other guys up there, maybe Josh Taylor, you could even say. And then you have guys like Mike Schwarin or Darwinzon Hernandez, who maybe they start, maybe they relieve, maybe they do some kind of hybrid role. It seems like that's just kind of been the get volume, just optimize all of it, and we'll see what happens, whether it's to help the major league club or in trades, like you said, with the Beaks, with the guys that all got traded in the Addison Reed deal, Callahan, Nagosic, Gerson Batista. You're right, it does seem like kind of a sea change in what before it was just kind of like keep guy as starter, make him, wait it out as long as possible to see if this person will be a starter. And then okay, now that we're calling you up tomorrow, you're going to be a reliever, even though you've never pitched in that role before. It just seems to make a lot more sense to me.
Yeah, well, they're right. And the game has changed in a way that there's considerable value to that relief role that maybe didn't exist
right
2 years ago. Or certainly not to the same extent. And so, so they view it as a considerable success if they're able to, to take guys who have potentially explosive stuff. They're trying to figure out their upside as quickly as possible, so that they can have a better defined development track for them, without waiting for a super long time, without losing years before putting them on that track.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, anyone who's listening, if you haven't read it yet, Alex's story in the Globe on January 4th, it technically ran, how the Red Sox rebuilt their pitching infrastructure. You can also get it from his Twitter at Alex Speier. And I'll try and remember to tell Joe to link to it actually in the write-up for the podcast. Of course, it is the off season, which means rankings, Alex, and it means overanalyzing the number we put in front of a player's name and how important that is. But it is kind of an interesting year. Some years we have you on and we talk rankings and we talk about why we agree on most of the stuff. But this year it's really an interesting situation where, as you've described both in print and on air, on podcasts, I think you were on Baseball America's podcast talking about this, where it's just number one isn't even for sure. And I think you said that there were five or so guys that could have been number one. Is this almost as maybe not wide open, but it seems like it's very kind of flat in the sense where there's not a whole lot of difference between guys, even at the top, when you put together a ranking list in the system right now. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, I would say that this was about as challenging a year. There wasn't a guy who screams number one prospect, like what he's supposed to be in a farm system. A guy who has, who combines probability, like high probability with high ceiling, like that guy doesn't necessarily exist in the Red Sox farm system right now, at which point you have this kind of jumble of what do you really prioritize? And it's going to be different for different organizations. It's going to be different for scouts versus analysts versus, different organizations have widely disparate views about who the number one guy is in the Red Sox system. Yeah. I mentioned there were five guys who I thought had legitimate consideration as number one at different points. Bobby Dahlbeck, Michael Chavis, who I ended up putting as number one. Right. Michael Chavis, who I ended up with 2. Jay Groom at 4. Tristan Casas at 5. And I had one organization tell me that Anthony Flores, who I put at number 9, simply because one organization told me they had him as their number one prospect. He's a guy who hasn't played really except for a couple games above the DSL. So this is, you're kind of all over the place. Do you like tools? If you like tools, then Dahlbeck is pretty clearly your guy, even though he has an enormous strikeout rate that creates all kinds of questions about probability for him. Chavis is probably the highest probability big league guy, but you do wonder what the ceiling is. Like there's a lot of it's funny because I was going through this exercise of doing the rankings before the playoffs, and and the image that I was getting in my mind of Chavis was kind of Steve Pierce-like, and that's a kind of modest profile until it became a very immodest profile over the course of the World Series. But that there's a decent chance that Michael Chavis's future big league role is as a right-handed bat who's able to move around at a couple of positions. there's also a chance that he's an everyday guy, but he's not. But even if he's an everyday guy, he's probably not like a superstar everyday guy. He would be like more of a solid average to maybe ceiling of tick above average type of everyday regular. Groom is the guy who has a ton of ceiling, but he's now 2 years out from being drafted and has thrown less than 100 professional innings, and is going to be coming back from Tommy John, which does affect probability, right? Like, there's 20% of Tommy John cases don't make it back. That is, you assume that guys are going to come back.
Yeah, people take it for granted.
You have to. It has to affect how you view his probability. Cassis has barely played professionally, has a huge ceiling based on what was seen in his amateur time. But I mean, we've seen so many high school hitters just get it handed to them once they turn pro, let alone making it to the big leagues, that it's difficult to put too much on him. And Flores, as mentioned, he's a DSL guy, so. So really, there's just not that clear top of the system. There's not a Devers, there's not a Moncada, there's not a Benintendi where you have confidence that this is going to be at least where there's a floor of an everyday big leaguer with a ceiling of a star. That doesn't exist in the system right now.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting because, like you said, you look at a Dahlbeck, and it's completely reasonable. And people might look at our lists because we have Dahlbeck at 5. But, like, I honestly don't think there's that big of a difference between our lists because I think we've got, like, the same top 5, right? And it's just a matter of what you like you said. I completely get putting Bobby Dahlbeck at number 1. I was in Potomac during one of his, I think I saw 3 games in 4 days, and he hit home runs in 2 of them and hit 3 doubles or something. And when you see him like that, it's like, oh, this guy's going to be a star. And then you realize that, like, in the at-bats where he doubled, he swung and missed horribly at curveballs in all of them, and it's like in AAA, never mind at the major leagues, does that turn into a strikeout? But it's weird to have your number 1 prospect in the system have a non-zero chance of moving to the mound and making the major leagues as a pitcher. That isn't like a Casey Kelly, Brendan McKay type or Ohtani, I guess. Put it another way, like there were guys who received consideration for number 1 in the Red Sox system, who some organizations had outside of their top 10. Yeah,
it is totally scrambled at the top in my mind.
Well, let's go to this then. Looking at what they have, what do you see as the system's strengths? I mean, obviously one of them, and this is something that you addressed in your companion piece in the Globe when the rankings got released at BA. It's just how deep third base is. At both close to the majors and maybe including the majors if you want to throw Devers in there, given that he's still, looks like he is, 15. But
he's not that far removed from being 15.
I know. It's kind of funny. We have a young graduates section on the front page of our website, and it's been great to have all of these guys in the majors at like 22 because they stay on the front page of our website until they turn 25. And Devers is still just 22. He's going to be there for 3 more years, and it seems insane to me.
He's going to be a free agent, and he's still going to be in there.
He might. It's insane. But, I mean, you look at, you've got Devers, Chavis, Dahlbeck. Even if you want to make a corner infield, you could kind of throw a Josh Ockamy in there, although he's kind of fallen behind the pace there. But then you look in the low minors at this crew of the 3 guys from this year's draft in Casas, who probably is moving to first, but we'll put him at third base in this group for now. Brandon Howlett and, Nick Northcutt. You've got Danny Diaz coming up from the DSL. I mean, third base is a stacked position in the majors too, but I can't remember them being this kind of loaded at one position relative to everywhere else in the system in a long time. I guess there's 2 different areas to look at. As far as a strength, does that stand out as well to you? And I guess as a follow-up to that, how on earth does this shake out? Or is it just kind of, obviously in the low minors you wait and see, but even in the high minors, do they just wait and see, or do you think they have a plan?
Well, I think that at the low minors, you kind of let it play itself out. At the upper minors, Dave Dombrowski has talked in the past about how he believes in taking positions of potential redundancy and turning them into dressing positions that do not feature redundancy. So, he's someone who's always looking to, he's Dealer Dave for a reason, right? And so I think that there's the Red Sox are going to be in a position where they're going to be looking to address needs, and third base is the obvious place to go. The last time that this was the case at there was a time when this was the case on the left side of the infield in an interesting way in the 2013 season when you had Iglesias having finally broken through to be pretty decent at the big league level. Will Middlebrooks was there but struggling in the big leagues, and Xander Bogaerts was coming and projecting as maybe projecting at that time as a third baseman, maybe, or even with the possibility of being a shortstop. There was an idea that he had a pretty good chance to contribute in 2013 at third base. And lo and behold, they ended up dealing Iglesias to clear the logjam a little bit in order to get Jake Peavy. When you have this in the upper levels, then you end up dealing. You don't want to wait too long to deal from it. You don't want to wait until you've eroded your flexibility. You don't want to wait until you're out of options on one of those guys before dealing them. They're not nearly in that position with regards to Chavis and Dahlbeck, but Chavis's clock has kind of started now, right? Because he's now been added to the 40-man roster, so it starts to become a bit of a thing. Akami and Sam Travis are in that strange corner twilight zone of where their prospect value has diminished somewhat, actually fairly significantly, quite honestly, in the last year plus, and so they will probably be viewed as tradable assets as well. But even at the lower levels, like it's just so weird to have that many guys stacked up where Howlett, Diaz, Cassis, Northcutt could all be viewed as considerations for, at some point next year. Like, it's not entirely outlandish to think that they could all be considerations for Greenville. They probably can avoid too much of a log jam. They can maybe delay it a bit, but it starts to get a little bit strange in terms of finding playing time. So yeah, they'll have some. They at least have an area that they can draw from. Yeah,
and the interesting piece to that, you mentioned the 2013 left side of the infield situation. You could also throw in Garrett Zucchini in there as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
That's great kind call. Of the lesson there is, just because you think there's a logjam doesn't necessarily mean, all of these guys, you have to make room for them or deal them. Although I guess maybe dealing, well, you can do so while you're
high. Find a way to you want to find a way to capture some value from an asset that's valuable.
And, honestly, I hadn't written this down to ask about, but it really does seem at this point, we're a few years in on Dave Dombrowski. He's excellent at that. It's stunning. I mean, he's only really lost, quote unquote, one trade. I mean, it's almost uncanny the way he deals these guys at the peak of their value sometimes. Do you have any insight into how he's able to do this? Is it just kind of knowing the secret sauce behind the scenes? Or, we have all this agita about trading guys, and then 3 years later it's like, oh, well, that worked out great. It's almost uncanny.
It's really impressive. Believe me, I'm still trying to figure out the secret code to how this happens so consistently. But he has a track record of rarely failing to capture value dating back to Detroit. He's rarely been burned by guys who became better after he traded them than they were at the time of the trade. I mean, you can make an argument about Andrew Miller, but after he traded, he got Miguel Cabrera for Andrew Miller, and it took Andrew Miller 5 years after that to become a meaningful big leaguer, by which point he had been released by a couple of teams. So, so it is really impressive, particularly because he came into a farm system that he didn't know, and figured out and got the right information to get the guys who, he picked the right ones to keep by and large.
And I mean, part of that too, it's been surprising. He certainly brought in a few of his guys, the Frank Wrens of the world, but there's still a lot of guys still around who were here before him. You think of the O'Hallorans, you think of Eddie Romero, of course. There's a lot of guys who are still Ben Crockett, Mike Rickard, plenty of guys still there. Even some guys that they just lost this offseason, but do you get the sense that this crew is going to stay together for a lot longer? I mean, obviously, Dombrowski, not that he's super old or anything like that. He is on the older side of this kind of youthful wave of MLB GMs coming in. Do you get the sense that in the front office at all, they're grooming guys like, a Romero or Halloran to kind of take the step up and groom them to replace Dombrowski, or is it just kind of like, look, we'll keep grooming you professionally, and maybe when it's time for them to move on and take the Mike Hazen GM job or to move on elsewhere, they'll go ahead and do that. Do you have any insight on what those machinations look like? Because we've had some people talking about that a little bit on our forums in the off season. It's just kind of like, well, I was ready to counter them and say, oh, well, Dombrowski's not that old, but he's one of the older GMs in baseball, or if you want to call it quote unquote GM, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, he's been doing this for a long time, but he's so passionate about it. He is signed, I believe, through 2020, and he will, and he wants to do it beyond that by all accounts. And the Red Sox have already expressed interest. John Henry, right before the Duck Boat Parade, said, "Yeah, we've got to, make sure that we." That we address Dave's situation. So I don't think that they have any plans on seeing him go anytime soon either. So they continue to promote the guys, the quote unquote holdovers. Like you see Zach Scott, for instance, who's in charge of analytics.
Right.
He just was promoted to assistant GM. Eddie Romero and Brian O'Halloran just received a kind of title promotion from. I think, from senior vice presidents to executive vice presidents this past offseason. So they continue to retain and value that long-term institutional wisdom. It served them well. It served Dombrowski well.
Mm-hmm, for sure. I guess in terms of retaining, maybe switching to some guys who, they aren't in our purview anymore, but they were once. We've talked a lot about here on the podcast about kind of how it seems like there's a window, not necessarily of in which the organization will compete, but just in this core staying together. And there's a point that's really coming up of they're going to have to either lock some of these guys up or move on, or what the deal is. There was a report this week from I think that was Evan Drellick, who reported that they're at least in talks with one player about an extension. Do you get any sense from the front office that they're going to start? I mean, they've obviously talked about it. But, at what point are we going to start seeing some decisions made? Obviously, Mookie Betts has said that he wants to, or at least the reporting is that he's wanted to go year to year. But at what point?
He's said that every time he's ever been asked. Yeah.
Okay. Well, at what point are they going to start, will we start to see some of these more long-term machinations of, okay, I get they're trying to keep the band together for one more run in 2019. It makes perfect sense. But at some point, there's going to have to be some calls made in who they're going to keep or, not keep, I guess, is what it is. What do you get the sense of the front office is looking at for that? Is that next off season? Is that this off season?
I think that they'd like to discuss it anytime that any of those guys want to entertain the conversation. But those are all guys who, when you think about it, they're young. They've made a good amount of money. They don't have a great deal of it. They don't have the financial insecurity that would drive them necessarily to make deals, right? Like so. You're looking at an entire generation of young players, of young star players that do not extend, right? Chris Bryant, is an extend, has turned down every overture the Cubs ever made. Mm-hmm. Bryce Harper turned down every overture the Nationals ever made. This is, David Price turned down long-term overtures because he wanted to test the market. Max Scherzer wanted to test the market. We are in an era where players who are stars like testing their market worth. And, I think that teams are interested, but the number of extensions that you've actually seen in recent years of stars, was Trout the last one that was really a superstar who extended? You just don't see a bunch of them. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like it's kind of a trend that died off, and that conversation we could have a whole podcast about the coming CBA negotiations and the state of free agency in baseball and that whole environment. But yeah, it seems like the extension thing has just kind of died off as guys realize that they're cutting their earning potential so significantly.
I agree.
Yeah. All right. I guess looking at a couple other, MLB type topics that do factor in the farm system a little bit. We've heard a lot. Obviously, it seems like the last piece this offseason the Red Sox are searching for is in the bullpen. We've heard that they're willing to stand pat. We also heard that they were fine with the lineup last year before signing J.D. Martinez. Do you get the sense that there's any – it seems to me that this is a game of musical chairs and Dave Dombrowski is waiting for the music to stop and get a deal on someone, whether that's Craig Kimbrell or whether it's someone else. What's your sense on what their plan is in the bullpen? Do you think they actually are fine with what they have? Do you think we're fine with what we have, but ... Or, do you think they're actively – I mean, obviously they're interested in guys like an Ottavino or some of these guys who've recently signed like David Robertson. But what's your take on where they're at in the bullpen at this point? Yeah,
I think that it's, see if there's a really attractive deal that materializes. Last year at the end of spring training, really, you had Tony Watson signing, left-hander signing with the Giants for something like 3 years and $7 million or something, right, obscenely low like that. If there is a high leverage reliever who would sign late in the off season for 1 year and short money, I think that they would have to think long and hard about that. But I just really don't think that they are they're that intent on marshaling a bunch of money and putting it into a reliever, particularly on a multi-year deal, given that they are really trying. They're pretty focused on trying to retain as much of the position core and or sale as they can beyond 2019 and 2020.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you think that part of the factor there is the fact that they've got, so many of these guys? It seems like it's kind of the prospect topic du jour in the system this offseason is that they've got a bunch of guys who might be ready to help out in the bullpen in the very near future. And Travis Lakins, who's in the bullpen already, Mike Schwarren, who pitched out of the bullpen in Arizona, Darwinzon Hernandez, who pitched out of the bullpen in Arizona. That's I don't think quite belongs in that group necessarily, but you could talk about him there. They're really high on Colton Brewer. It seems like I think a lot of people are maybe kind of taking that name for granted. Do you think that factors into, we've got some arms that could come in and maybe become, maybe not a closer, but a 7th, 8th inning guy?
Not for the coming year. Okay. I think that they aren't taking the transition to the big leagues for granted for any of those guys. So I think that there's hope on their part that they might be able to get some impact contributors out of the system, but they don't just assume that it's going to. They don't assume it's going to happen. So I think that that was something that that I was curious about as well earlier in the offseason. And the sense that I got was that no, they're not just assuming that they're going to have Durbin Feltman or Darwinzon Hernandez wiping out hitters in October, but that they feel overall pretty good about what they're able to do with, again, kind of taking the raw materials of pitching and molding it into the bullpen that they need. And I think that there's also a pretty good confidence interval that they can make mid-season moves for bullpen help. They've made pitching moves. They've had 3 straight seasons of making relatively low-cost and significant mid-year pitching additions. When you're looking at like Brad Ziegler back in 2016, who was actually like understatedly awesome, which right. no one's going to remember that, but he was like. His numbers are bonkers. Addison Reed in 2017, obviously, and then Evaldi this year. All of those guys were pretty big difference makers, and they were able to get them. The best prospect given up for any of those guys was Jalen Beeks, and that's Jalen Beeks has a chance to be a pretty good pitcher in the big leagues for a while, but he's not the high, he's not the anchor of a rotation who's going to give you. I don't think that he's not the kind of point of pain that was necessary to acquire Chris Sale in an offseason when he had 3 years of control left.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, look, you trade Jalen Beeks just for what Evaldi's already done, every day of the week and twice on Sunday. So that's a great point. The other major league thing I wanted to ask you about, because it's really I have no idea how this is going to shake out myself. Do you have any clue how the catching situation shakes out this year?
No, I don't. I would be surprised if Vazquez doesn't have a significant role. It just, They love what he became in October what they thought he was going to be when they signed him to that extension. He is extended for a little while, so there's control over him. There's a known, as opposed to, that'd be an awfully big roll of the dice if you were to trade Vasquez and say, okay, Blake Swihart's going to be our future everyday catcher. I think that most conversations about Swihart are prefaced with, like, we think that he can be a pretty impactful player, whether it's for us or not. I think that it would just be really surprising to me if Vasquez didn't have a significant role in 2019 and beyond.
Yeah, based on just the non-usage last year, I just find it hard to believe that the switch would completely flip this year, myself on Swihart. But we'll see what winds up shaking down there. Ian, do you have any questions to throw in? I've just got like a lightning round lined up after this, but do you have anything that I missed that you think we should hit?
Well, just briefly, I think the only other question mark on the major league team that I could think of was second base. Do you have any idea if there's like kind of a concrete timeline on Dustin Pedroia coming back, or even guys like Marco Hernandez, or is it just going to be like it was last year with Eduardo Nunez, Brock Holt kind of mishmash there to start the year at least?
Well, don't forget Sue Lin as well.
Oh,
I think
of course,
Lin is a pretty Lin's a good player, man. There's a fair amount of disagreement about his overall impact, but he probably hits the ball harder than Holt. There's probably more exit velo there, I think, and there's a pretty good package of skills there. So between those three guys, I think that they just feel comfortable that if Pedroia is ready at the start of the season, great. Hernandez, I think, is going to, he's going to need months in the minor leagues to get his timing back if he's ever ready to go again. And I have always maintained that shoulder injuries are incredibly daunting and incredibly risky. They're really hard to come back from sometimes. So it'll be really interesting to see what Hernandez is able to offer, if ever, if anything, at some point in the future. But Pedroia, they have some hope for, and we'll see what the timetable is. It would be foolish to commit to one right now, given what happened last year.
Fair enough.
All right, well, let's close this out, Alex, with some lightning round. I'll throw some quick questions at you, and you can give me your answers.
Yeah.
And as detailed as you'd like, or just shoot them off quick. Let's start with Bobby Dahlbeck as your number one prospect in the system. What is his future MLB role, or I guess projection, in your eyes?
Shohei Ohtani. No, kidding. Honestly, I think I have. I don't. That's the whole.
Right. Yeah, that was mean.
Right?
I know. I'm sorry.
It's a probabilistic. Like, you evaluate it from a probabilistic model, right? Like, where you recognize the range of possible outcomes. Like, to me, I think that there's a decent chance that Bobby Dahlbeck ends up being like a 6 or 7 hole hitter who has massive power. Maybe he's a 240 average guy but who has decent on base abilities. So like an OBP above 300, and plays pretty good defense. So maybe it's Mark Reynolds with better defense. Maybe it's, that would be, I think that they would sign on for that.
Yeah.
Well, because I think with him, he is someone whose defense gets underrated. I think he's a much better defender than people realize.
Yeah, I think that, scouts were floored by the amount of progress that he's made and how smooth he looked, how much range he showed, and the arm is obviously electric, which is why, as you guys referenced earlier, there's a discussion about whether or not he ends up being a pitcher rather than a third baseman.
I just think it's just playing along with what you were saying. Like, if you ask 10 scouts what Bobby Dahlbeck's outcome are, you're probably going to get 10 completely different answers, because there's such a wide range for players in the upper minors that, if he's Mike Hessman and never makes it and, has a cup of coffee occasionally, but it sets the AAA home run record, I could buy that. But as you said, he could also be like a Mark Reynolds, or heck, you could probably convince someone he could be Joey Gallo light. Like, you never know.
Right.
Big range of you're absolutely right. Big dartboard to start chucking at.
Yeah. Well, maybe this one will be a little bit narrower of a dartboard. Darwinzon Hernandez's MLB role at his peak.
I guess it depends on the organization, because, in an organization that would value him as a 4 to 5 inning pitcher with, kind of electric stuff, you could see him in that kind of Beeks-ish role. But his stuff is just, I just find it hard to think that, that it's the temptation won't be so great with him in the bullpen if he's able to just lock down throwing strikes with a couple pitches. I've got to think he's kind of a, Josh Hader light, or something like a serious late innings weapon who just, I have never seen anyone take a comfortable swing against him. I don't know if you have the same experience, guys, but he's you don't know if they're going to be strikes, but you know that they aren't going to be like, you know that guys aren't going to have a really aggressive swing against it.
Yeah, I think we. Yeah, well, I was going to say I caught bad Darwinson once this year, and he didn't get out of the second. But but then the next time it was probably his best start of the year in Salem. So I hear you, Ian.
Well, and I think we kind of saw a preview of that in the fall league, where I'm just looking at the stats now. He struck out 24 guys in 11 innings.
And and early it was like 12 guys in the first 13 innings.
Yeah, because I think he had 2 bad starts.
Or no, it was in the first 6 innings or something. It was overpowering.
Because he had 2 bad outings in there where he didn't strike out anyone. But yeah, it's just, I think you were there with me. We were both there for his AA debut. And didn't he strike out the side while also hitting 2 guys and walking 2 guys or something along those lines?
It was exciting. And it was exciting. He filled up the line score, man. It was good.
But you could see the hitters had no chance. It's just
no one takes a comfortable swing. No one.
All right,
except when Chris sees him that one time.
Yeah,
Thanks,
exactly.
Chris, for messing with the narrative.
Well, that was I think the day before Brian Mata hadn't gone out of the second either, so it was a weird week in Potomac.
It's Potomac. What do you expect?
Yeah, it's always a weird week at Potomac. They need to blow that park up. All right, both Steve Pearce and Mitch Moreland are around this year, but is the 2020 Major League first baseman currently in the Boston Red Sox organization?
I believe that, I think that we're at the point, some of those other questions that we're talking about with regards to trying to save some money to extend other guys, they have to have the 2020 first baseman, or at least the Steve Pearce part of that has to be in the organization right now. I just think that it would be startling if they didn't conjure something that was really inexpensive by that point as a first base solution.
Sounds right to me. Next year,
it would be Pedro Castellanos. No, I'm kidding. But don't forget Pedro.
One of these years, he's going to hit 25 home runs. Just wait.
Well, he hit 8. He hit 8 in the Venezuelan minor league this offseason, even though he hit 1 all summer. So,
don't try.
Just waiting for that. Just waiting for him to start espousing the philosophy of on plane, and here he comes.
Yeah,
I mean, his BP during Instructs, people were like, "How many home runs did he hit during the regular season?" I'd be 1, and the scouts would look at me like, "Excuse me?"
Yeah,
yeah.
He's
it makes no sense,
dude. He's such a weird prospect,
it's
right?
It's so strange.
Who's a 6'4", 6'4" giant of a first baseman who does nothing but hits ground balls and
never strikes out.
Yeah, and never strikes out.
Never strikes out. Doesn't walk either, but he never strikes out, and makes a ton of contacts and doesn't hit home runs. But then in BP, he'll just casually hit 350, 400-foot bombs to left field. It's strange.
All right, how about this? Next year at this time, who's number 1 on the Red Sox top prospect list?
I'm gonna go with. Okay, so I'm.
Do it. You want to.
Well, I have 3 candidates in mind.
That's fair.
Casas, right? Casas has a chance to be a monster. Although, I also don't want to skirt past the fact that high school guys in their first year in full season ball are just getting carved up in pro ball right now. So, but I still think that Casas has a chance to be really, really good, really fast in the minor leagues. So he would have a chance to me. I would also, and then, I would say Anthony Flores has a pretty interesting shot because he's a true shortstop prospect who shows above average skills in a lot of different, above average to plus skills in multiple facets of the game. And then and then this guy who we haven't really talked about and who's Gilberto Jimenez.
Yes, there he is.
Who is, kind of one of these out of nowhere signed for nothing guys who the Red Sox have done a pretty remarkable job of finding in recent years. But he, that's a really interesting, pretty complete skill set.
Mm-hmm.
It just seems like a monster athlete who discovered he can play baseball, basically, is what I've heard.
Yeah, and while doing so, not just from a tools standpoint, but it showed up in games a lot. Like that was a really interesting, and for a guy who really is just he's fresh to switch hitting. It's startling how well he performed at his unnatural side of the plate, given that he was in his first year ever as a switch hitter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you hadn't said him, I was going to ask who your sleeper was this year, just more or less to elicit the Gilberto Jimenez. But I guess other than those three guys, do you have a sleeper for us for this year you found during your research or following the system?
There's a lot of love for Jarren Duran, who's an out-of-nowhere seventh-round pick. The Red Sox have done a really good job over the course of the last 20 years, if you think about it, in finding undervalued college assets, guys who didn't really Duran is a little bit strange because he has athleticism and he does have he has the clear tool of speed, and he's not the kind of he's not the weird body type of Euclid or Pedroia that explains them slipping, but he's pretty interesting. Like his performance was outrageously good. You would hold up next to that of the pro debuts of guys like Benintendi and Ellsbury and say, oh yeah, that kind of fits. It's that's a guy who, if he shows that wasn't just a fluke, that significant outperformance of his college track record, if he does that this year in Salem and maybe Double-A, then all of a sudden that is a guy who starts to turn some heads quickly. But I have no idea if that's going to happen. And then the other guy, if he ever stays healthy for more than a month at a time, would blast up into consideration for the big leagues from out of nowhere, would be Zach Schellinger, because he does nothing. It's like we were talking about with at the top with Darwinson Hernandez. Like he's a guy who no hitter has a comfortable at bat against. Everything is a ground ball or a strikeout for him. And, his stuff is clearly big league caliber, but he's really had a hard time staying on the field.
Well, he was someone, when you were mentioning at the beginning, when you and Chris were discussing your recent article, he was a guy who you look at because he's 6'5", kind of a big guy. You could think maybe we try to turn this into a starter, but as you said, he's had major trouble staying healthy and everything. But I mean, I saw him in Instructs this year, and the stuff was outstanding. He's sitting mid-90s with like a plus slider, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that's a big leaguer eventually if he stays healthy. But
before the 2018 season, I had a scout of another organization say clear top 10 prospect in the Red Sox system if he was ever healthy.
Wow.
Yeah. I remember I had an amateur guy told me that when they saw him, I think it was on the Cape or something. The one time he was healthy, and he was sitting mid to high 90s, and he was touching 100, and then he just came out and had a junior year where he had a bunch of stuff going on and barely pitched, and obviously he's barely pitched with the Red Sox except for that Greenville stint last year where he was electric. So yeah, he's another one who's really interesting to me too.
Beautiful. Well, Alex, we've already probably taken too much of your time. You've got to get back to your family. We appreciate you coming on a dreary January evening, but of course everyone should go follow Alex at Alex Speier. You got anything else you need to plug, Alex, before we sign off?
I think at some point it'll probably interest you. I'll probably have a follow-up on the article that I wrote about the Red Sox pitching infrastructure with more of that conversation focused on the minor league level, and a lot of some of the stuff that we were discussing today, but thinking a lot about how they view where their minor league pitcher development is, because a great deal of the article's emphasis was on what they're doing at the major league level. But there's a lot happening. There's a lot that they think is happening beneath the surface, and it has to, because the strength of their system from a pitching standpoint is that group that, barely, where almost no one matriculated as far as AA this year. So Portland is going to be, this is kind of a landmark affiliate year for pitching. What happens in Portland this year to that pitching staff has a pretty significant sway over the next few years of what the Red Sox are doing.
Yeah, you kind of alluded to it at the top when we were kind of talking about, but not talking about, Tanner Houck and just that crew that started in Salem last year and is kind of slowly moving up. So we'll definitely keep an eye out for that. And then you have guys that have come out of nowhere. We didn't even get to talk about Denny Reyes, who just is still a complete mystery.
He'll be in AA too, so he's part of it. He's part of it.
Definitely. Well, we'll definitely keep an eye out for that. Again, make sure everybody follows him at Alex Speier on Twitter. Alex Speier's on the Twitter. Alex Speier's on the podcast. We love having you on, Alex. Thank you so much, man.
It's always a blast. Thanks, guys. Really good to catch up with you.